business, and these have been incredibly helpful to furthering this technology and ensuring the success of the organization. Lastly, I'd like to talk a bit about the specific benefits of this technology as we see it applying in healthcare as a mechanism to reduce healthcare fraud, but also to provide significant clinical benefits. As you might imagine, this technology has a whole host of applications that it can be used for. We think one of the most exciting applications for it is the healthcare fraud industry. In healthcare fraud, you really have a delicate balance between offering a high level of security against consumer acceptability and usability. So take the security side of the spectrum. You have things such as fingerprint biometrics, iris scans, and these are incredibly effective at verifying identity. However, the vast majority of consumers are not comfortable with the privacy invasion that is associated with these types of technologies. On the other end of the spectrum, you have things such as written signatures that are very consumer acceptable. However, they don't provide a great degree, unfortunately, of verification. We see Sign here as perfectly balancing these two needs by offering a biometric level of security similar to a fingerprint scanner with a very consumer acceptable medium, which is the written signature. And in fact, in healthcare alone, written signatures minimally have to be used 3 times to provide service for patients. A further benefit for this idea of consumer usability and acceptability is the actual technology itself, since it's acoustic based, doesn't even capture a visual image of your signature. So if in the unlikely event that these signature templates were ever compromised, any potential fraudster would only have incoherent acoustic data, so they could never reverse engineer the actual image of the signature, which is important for consumers because with identity theft on the rise, it's a big concern. So we avoid that scenario. The last thing I would like to talk about is really the clinical benefit of fraud prevention. One of the biggest issues in fraud is fraudulent claims being submitted through to payers, whether that be unethical providers or fraud rings that are set up, what we call ghost providers, that actually submit fake claims. The problem with that is these fake claims now go on the record of patients. So what happens is you have clinical data that is not representative of the actual patient. And this could lead to all kinds of dangerous situations, such as physicians misdiagnosing patients, prescribing pills or medications that are not appropriate. On the provider side, obviously this opens them up to things like malpractice issues. So beyond the pure element of saving on fraud, we really have a clinical benefit that this produces as well. I'd now like to invite up Vice President of ALARIS, Stephen Williams, who has a significant background in healthcare administration, and he's going to speak to you a bit more about the specifics of healthcare fraud and how our technology fits into that. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. As Jimmy identified, healthcare fraud is an issue which is, I think, far more significant than most people realize. I think most people understand there's a little bit of fraud element to almost any aspect of commerce, but it is incredibly prevalent in the healthcare industry. The figures that are bantered around, and these are not our figures, they come from what I believe are fairly reliable sources, such as the FBI. Also, as the screen over there indicates, they come from an independent research done by Reuters International. And generally speaking, the percentage of healthcare expenditure which is now allocated to paying for fraud approximates 10% of the entire healthcare budget. On a national perspective, the FBI estimates there's about a $220 billion annual fraud scheme. If you apply that 10% to the current access budget, which is about $10.6 billion, you have over $1 billion in access fraud. We all know Arizona's position in terms of identity theft. there's no reason to believe that Access and Arizona's percentage of healthcare fraud is any less than the national average of 10%. So our positioning here is that that 10% of Access budget is better spent addressing clinical issues than it is profiting those who are committing fraud. The nature of healthcare fraud really falls into three principal categories, and I think most people will be surprised at those categories. There are fraud rings, usually offshore organizations, who create felonious clinics. They literally crack or steal or are sold a doctor's database, his reimbursement claim number, and his database of patients. They set up what Jeremy has described as a ghost clinic that doesn't really exist. They submit claims for the patient database belonging to the doctor. They are paid for that, and by the time they're caught, often it's in the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars that are being expended. If you were to check the ABC News from about a month ago, you'll see that recently the FBI cracked a multi-state ring. They rounded up almost 100 professionals, mostly comprised of doctors and nurses, nurse practitioners. And in a few short months, that group had built the system for over $200 million in healthcare fraud. So this thing is omnipresent. The next most virulent cause of healthcare fraud are literally the providers themselves. There are many providers who, because they have access to their own patient database, slip in a few extra patient visits a day. And it's incredibly prevalent. If you were to use our technology, you'd understand that without a live date-stamped patient authenticating by his biometric signature that he actually presented at a clinic on a particular time at a particular day, there's no way that the fraud rings or the provider can create a felonious visit. The missing element is, of course, the patient with that authenticated signature. And as Jeremy identified, the last criteria for healthcare fraud really falls on patients passing around their credentials, either knowingly or unknowingly having someone taking those credentials. And Jeremy has already talked about the clinical repercussions of that. The repercussions of that are even larger than just the clinical issues. If you were to go to TRICARE's website, TRICARE is the military's healthcare provider, both nationally and internationally. In their 2009 report on fraud, they identified that many returning military are denied positions of gainful employment because of issues in their medical records, which in fact are not theirs. And it is much harder to get one of those medical issues removed from your record than it is to clear up regular identity theft. Healthcare identity theft absolutely destroys, potentially, an individual's background screening. It also utilizes their healthcare reimbursements. So an individual can go to a healthcare facility expecting to have treatment and be told, I'm sorry, you've had so many claims this year, you and your family are no longer eligible. They can also be charged incredible rates for having medical conditions that are not theirs. So the whole idea here is to take an entirely different perspective on healthcare fraud. Instead of the typical current approach, which is to wait until there's an anomaly in a doctor's billing services or somebody turns in a fraudster, which means that the healthcare fraud has already been perpetuated. Our perspective is let's stop the healthcare fraud before it is committed. Let's stop it when that presenting patient arrives at a healthcare facility who is not the individual they say they are, and let's stop the expenditure right there and then. Those savings then can accrue back to the benefit of the healthcare system and be expended on clinical patient issues, which are serious and life-threatening, of which we have examples before us. But surely a better use of our healthcare funds is in supporting genuine clinical issues than it is supporting the bank account of fraudsters and fraudulent providers. With that, I'll turn it back to Representative Seal, who will introduce some members of the public who are currently benefiting from the access and who we hope will benefit from the savings not perpetuated by fraud. Representative Seal?
Thank you. Yes, at this time, if several of the people in the public that are here today, if you'd step forward, please. I'd appreciate that.
Alex, go with you.
In the next few minutes, you're going to hear from three basic people. You're going to hear from Jana Merle, that's going to talk about her son and relationship to access and treatment. going to hear from Mr. Phil Hart, who's going to talk about his own personal experience with hemophilia and the true savings by being efficient with our medical billing.